The part 2 will focus on the dependence and independence. Last week, Professor Li also mentioned that in a global negotiation and on the issues of human rights and so on and so forth, China argued that we reject any foreign intervention. We decide by ourselves only. So how that attitude historically shaped? This is the big question. So I started from here on the dependence, the issue of dependence and independence. In his memoirs, the last party secretary of Eastern Germany, Egon Krenz, explained the many reasons for the collapse of the entire state after the 1989. Many, many reasons, of course. Among these, he noted in particular that one of the most important reasons was the ongoing political transition in the Soviet Union and the ways in which these transitions affected internal transformations in Eastern Bloc itself. What he tried to argue? He tried to argue that, of course, tried to get rid of his own responsibility. But basically, he argued that the collapse of the East Germany was not because the domestic reasons. It was because something happened in Moscow. Then we collapsed. So this is he explained. He tried to explain the reason because he explained that even months earlier, Eastern Germany looked not that bad. Why it suddenly collapsed? Because some decision made by somebody else. Of course, Gorbachev and so on and so forth. His arguments like that. At the same time, his counterparts in the West in the negotiation, Western German politicians say that you have followed so-called doctrine of Brezhnev, so-called Brezhnev doctrine. What is the Brezhnev doctrine? Which means the incomplete sovereignty. Which means that in the whole Eastern Bloc, the only Soviet Union had the full sovereignty. All other states in the alley, they are not enjoy the full sovereignty at all. So that's why, because of this, something happened there, then sequence is here. So this is his explanation for this. And in his memoir afterwards, after the collapse of Eastern Germany, he said that actually, after the World War II, many people say that after the World War II, it was the formalization of the establishment of the sovereign systems in the global scale. However, during the Cold War period, the Cold War divided into two extremities, right? Bipolar system. Many states were joined the Allies. So he said that actually not only the Eastern Bloc states, even the Western Bloc states they didn't enjoy the full sovereignty. The full sovereignty only enjoyed by America, not the Western European countries. So he said that actually no exceptions in the Western contexts. However, this is a really interesting issue. I think it matters about the explanation of the fate of China after the 1989. Why? The problems are similar. A lot of problems similar. A lot of the contradictions, conflicts happened by the end of 1980s. So that's why Tiananmen protest and so on and so forth. But the political structure remained unchanged and very different from Soviet Union and the Eastern European Bloc. That need a kind of historical explanation. Look at China. People's Republic of China was established after the series of wars. Then, by 1950, less than 1 year, there was a war in Korean Peninsula. that forced China to confront the superpower, United States, and its allies, which means that in the west side, China was excluded. So that's why China have no choice to join. The only way is join the Eastern camp. The industrialization in the first 5 plan from 1950 to 1955, that years were heavily influenced by the Soviet Union. Most of the heavy industrial projects actually invested by the West, supported by the Soviet Union, not the West. So in that sense, some scholars argue that in that short period, the first 5 years, China could be described as a Sudan state of Soviet Union, subordinated to some extent. But actually, not that true. We need to remind us, Chinese Revolution was a long revolution, which was very different from the revolutions in Eastern European countries, that the single events. I remember a historian, quite a well-known American historian, Morris Meissner, in his very famous book, he made an argument in his work. He said that it was very difficult to define Chinese Revolution starting from a single event. For example, October Revolution in Russia, or the French Revolution. Some event happened. So the people argue that was the Russian Revolution, French Revolution marked by this event. But Chinese Revolution is a long process. It's difficult to use one single event to define that process. It's a long process. So much grassrooted. The whole mobilization of the society was in a whole long process. So in that sense, much more self-determined than any other countries by nature. It's not only in a formal level, substantively speaking, that the Communist Party in China compared to Eastern European communist parties, which was much more independent from any superpowers, not America and the Soviet Union. But at that time, China was the ally of Soviet Union. However, by mid-1950s, this year it was the 60 years anniversary of Bandung Conference. Do you remember that? That started from the non-ally, non-aligned moments for the third world countries. Not necessarily there may be anti-colonial, anti-imperialistic moments, but not the socialist countries. China actually actively involved in that moments, especially Premier Zhou Enlai. The 5 principles of the peaceful coexistence, and then developed into the 10 principles of peaceful coexistence in the Bandung Conference, was started from that time. So that was the decisive moments for China, for its performance and the basic position in the Cold War time, which means that China tried to keep distance from both American sides or the Soviet Union sides, tried to much more independent than any other country that he tried to. By the end of 1950s and early 1960s, China had the huge debate with the Soviet Union, political debates, debate between the 2 communist parties. By the end of 1960s, there was a border war between China and Russia. So Korean War, Vietnam War with America, and the political debates, theoretical debates, ideological debates up to the military conflicts with the Soviet Union that forced China to be independent. So to be independent is not only a choice, but we need to contextualize the whole process. So that's why at that time, Mao raised the issue, autonomy, the independence and autonomy, 独立自主, and the self-sufficiency, 自力更生. And so before the beginning of the Chinese reform, China already established a self-sufficient national economy. Though it's lower developed by the standard of Western standards, it's low. Developed, economically speaking, it's still very low. But it's self-sufficient. That was the position. If you look at the composition of this economy, multiplicity of the elements of economy, it's very different from colonial economy or the Allies. Actually, Mao rejected the Soviet Union, rejected the division of labors issued by the Soviet Union. So we need to understand the whole basic structure of the Chinese economic system before the reform. Then we can understand opening and the reform policy, what kind of the historical foundation that reform started. So in that sense, because of China trying to maintain its autonomy and independence, we could argue that China actually contributed to the gradual decline of the Cold War structure. Because basically after the World War II, the bipolar structure, that was this characteristic of the Cold War structure. Because China was a big country at that time already, the intervention, not trying to join each camps, but maintain a certain kind of the independence. So gradually, as one of the quite important forces to contribute to the gradual decline of the Cold War bipolar structure. So that was China's contribution. Started from, I think, active participation of the Bandung Conference and gradually transformed. That the whole structure transformed. So these were also important for us to explain the model. We know that about 2 decades ago, a lot of people, economists, explain the Chinese economic developments, arguing that China's model followed the pattern of so-called Eastern Asian model, right? Because after the Japan and the 4 small dragons, China also developed. There were some overlaps. For example, the role of government in the regulation of the market, and so on and so forth, and the Confucianism, and so on and so forth. However, if you look at the role of China during the Cold War period, compare that role with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, mainland China, actually was very different. Because basically, you see that the first stage of economic growth in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, as well as Hong Kong, it's really started from the Korean War and the Cold War. Militarily speaking, those states heavily relying on the Cold War structure, especially dominated by America up to now. Still, you can argue that there was no full sovereignty too, incomplete sovereignty. In that sense, still the case up to now. But these were very difficult to use these cases to compare to the situation of China in that period. I argue that is not argue for China, because that period was most tough, very tough period for China, very difficult, isolated and difficult. But this period give the historical condition, I think, for the next step of the opening and the reform. So it's a kind of the dialectical relations between the first phase and the second phase. So these type of the relatively independent and the completed sovereignty was achieved through the efforts of the party state and a historical political process. This is a unique feature in the 20th century political scene. So that's why Mao tried to trace all these political nature, the nature of political culture in the People's Republic of China, back to the whole long revolution. So that is, he spoke of the class structure. He used the classical Marxist the concepts. But actually, a lot of people argue that the connotation of these categories are radically different from those concepts in the Western context. I will give the further explanation for this.